Good morning, everyone. We are excited to welcome you to the webinar about understanding Wayfair and the local use tax. My name is Andrea Sitzes, and I serve as the president and CEO for Show Me Christian County. For those of you that are joining us throughout the region, I serve at the pleasure of all of the organizations here across the county, and we work for economic development from a holistic level. And with that, we are excited to present to you this topic, and we are doing that in partnership with the Southwest Missouri Council of Governments. And so today we have Ray McCarty with Associated Industries of Missouri, and also Chuck Pierce. And I know that Ray, you will introduce Chuck a little bit more, and both of you as your roles with AIM, but we are really excited to dive in today. So I am going to switch over and make you the host, Ray, so that we can go ahead and get started with this.
Excellent.
Perfect. All right, you should be able to do that. And while you are sharing your screen, I'll let all of our attendees know. So Ray is a 16-year veteran of the Missouri Department of Revenue. He has worked in the Missouri Capitol on behalf of the private sector, representing economic development organizations and businesses for 22 years. And he has been very involved in all aspects of tax legislation for more than 30 years. As he shares his insights and what he's gained over the years about his knowledge of this extremely complex issue, I know that you will gain information and insight. If you have questions along the way, please feel free to submit those through the Q&A, and I will be monitoring those, and we really look forward to digging in. So with that, Ray, if you're ready, I will turn it over to you.
All right, well, thanks very much. Can you see my screen, Andrea?
Yes, I can.
All right, very good. And we have Chuck Pierce joining us too. Chuck is with Pierce Company, and he is the top tax lobbyist in the Capitol these days. And I tell you what, between the two of us, I think we have more experience than probably anybody in the Capitol on tax issues. That sets us up to fall here, so I'm sure somebody will ask a question that neither one of us know the answer to. But we do have a lot of experience between the two of us. I started my career at the Department of Revenue. I worked there for 16 years. The last 10 years of that, I was in the legislative group. And you'll see as we go through the presentation, this is almost like a Forrest Gump presentation for me, because I feel like I was at every step of the way here in this issue. Starting with the Department of Revenue, then moving to the State Chamber, and now Associated Industries of Missouri. And in between there was a period where I represented the Missouri Economic Development Council as a lobbyist. And we passed a lot of really good legislation thanks to John Maynor and Rob O'Brien at the time in Joplin. They hired me to get some things done in economic development, and we were able to get quite a few things done, including Missouri Works and some other very good programs that are in use today. So we're going to get started and jump right into the internet sales and use tax issue. And as Andrea said, if you have questions, please type them in the Q&A, and we will answer those as after the presentation is over. So what started all this? Well, Wayfair versus South Dakota has been the most recent thing that's happened. And I thought I would talk a little bit about the South Dakota case and why it's important. The South Dakota had imposed their state and local sales taxes on sales that are made by retailers selling more than $100,000 worth of goods to customers in the state, or those that had more than 200 transactions with South Dakota customers, even if the retailer had no physical location in the state. At the time that South Dakota did this, there were two cases that kind of controlled in the area, Quill, and that reinforced an earlier case, Bellis Hess. And both of those Supreme Court cases had said that a retailer had to have a physical presence in the state in order to collect tax or to push the tax collection responsibility onto them. South Dakota decided to intentionally change that. So this was a setup case. They changed their law, said that that's what they were going to do. Wayfair challenged the law, and really it was kind of a friendly lawsuit to get the idea before the U.S. Supreme Court again. The U.S. Supreme Court, as I said, had previously ruled against that type of a taxing scheme and required a company to have a physical presence. It didn't have to be the retail store that was participating in the sale, but it had to be some kind of location in the state. A lot of warehouses were used to trigger nexus. If you had resident salespeople in the state, then that qualified. But if you didn't have any physical presence in the state up until the time that Wayfair versus South Dakota came down, you were not able as a state and local government to require any kind of collection responsibility on those companies. And the US Supreme Court overruled those two cases with the Wayfair decision. This allowed South Dakota's taxing scheme to stand. The factors that influenced this decision were ease of compliance with the tax laws. South Dakota had made it very easy to comply with their tax laws. They were a part of the Streamlined Sales and Use Tax Project, which we'll talk about here in a little bit. And they had de minimis exclusions in the law. Remember the $100,000 worth of goods or 200 transactions. So if a very small retailer was selling into the state, they didn't have to comply. But if they did more than 200 transactions, if they sold more than $100,000 worth of goods into the state, then they triggered that nexus requirement. The US Supreme Court decided that their internet presence is now at least as important as physical stores in today's economy, and they allowed that taxing scheme to stand, which sent states into a scurry mode, trying to figure out, okay, if South Dakota can do it, how can we do this as well? So let's talk about the differences between South Dakota and Missouri. South Dakota has basically two types of sales and use taxes. They have a state and local sales tax that applies to all sales made to South Dakota customers, regardless of where the retailer is located. Within South Dakota, outside South Dakota, it doesn't matter to them. All of those are sales tax transactions, and that's an important point. Consumer's use tax is a separate type of tax that they have, and that applies when a seller fails to collect the proper amount of tax, or if the tax that was collected was less than the tax that would be due in South Dakota, then the purchaser themselves has to self-remit that to the state. It's a consumer's use tax. So they have two types of taxes. They have state and local sales taxes, and they have consumer's use taxes. South Dakota's state and local sales tax was the subject of the court challenge in the Wayfair case and was found to be proper. In Missouri, we actually have three types of sales and use taxes, which makes us a little different. And actually, we're more like a lot of other states. We have a state and local sales tax that generally applies to sales made to Missouri customers by Missouri retailers, or where goods are shipped from a place in Missouri to the customer. We have a state and local vendors use tax that applies generally to sales that are made to Missouri customers by retailers outside the state of Missouri, providing that seller has nexus, some kind of physical location in Missouri, or if they voluntarily collect it. That's the type of tax that they're collecting right now. And then state and local consumers use taxes are due from purchasers, and they apply when a seller fails to collect the proper amount of tax, or if the tax collected was less than the sales tax that's due in Missouri. So we have three types of taxes. South Dakota had two. That's a pretty important distinction when we start talking about how we address this issue in Missouri. And we'll see about that here in a second. Our local use tax only applies in areas where local voters have approved applying that tax, either the county or city tax, to use tax transactions. So we have a special local use tax, local option, has to be approved by voters. Motor vehicles are taxed a little differently. I know we had a question submitted earlier about talking about the motor vehicle sales taxes, and this was an issue that had gone on for years. There was no challenge. Finally, someone, named Street, challenged this law and caused a disruption really in the way motor vehicle sales and use taxes are handled. We had kind of actually a fourth different type of tax, if you will, we won't go into, but it had to do with highway use tax. And that caused a lot of confusion in terms of whether that was really a use tax. It acted more like our vendors and consumers use tax, or was it, something different? It was intended to be something different and act more like a sales tax. So as a result of that court decision, the legislature went back in and kind of authorized a sales tax-like tax to be applied to those transactions where a person is purchasing a motor vehicle. If you buy it from a dealer, that's definitely a sales tax transaction. But if you buy it from someone who's not a dealer, that was formerly called a highway use transaction. They have now made those local sales taxes apply to those transactions. But the second bullet was the caveat. When they went back in, when the legislature went back in to authorize that tax and to clean that up, they said that local governments that had not adopted a local use tax must put a proposal before voters by November of 2022. I think originally it was November of 2016, and they bumped it off to November of 2022, to repeal the local sales tax on vehicle purchases from anyone other than a Missouri dealer. So if you're not one of those communities that's adopted a local use tax, you have to put this before voters, asking them if they want to repeal the local sales tax on vehicle purchases from anyone other than a dealer. A lot of local governments don't like that provision. There's probably a reason for that. I think the reason is it was going through the legislature. We didn't pay a lot of attention to this because we represent businesses in the Capitol, and this was not something that was really important to a lot of our businesses. But it was pretty high profile at the time. And I think the reason that they did that is because there was a feeling in the legislature that if you had a local use tax, part of the local use tax was that it would apply to these types of transactions. If voters had spoken on that already, then the legislature said, well, fine, voters knew what they were doing, and that's fine. So if you have a local use tax, they don't make you put this before voters. But if you don't have a local use tax, expanding that base to those types of transactions and making those motor vehicles now subject to sales tax at the local level, they felt like should have some voter input. And that's the reason I think they put that repeal provision in there. But that is in there now, and that is something that does apply. Another reason to adopt a local use tax if you don't have enough reasons already. So looking at taxes on internet sales. Now, what we talked about before were in general our types of taxes that we have in Missouri, but we also have taxes on internet sales already. State and local sales taxes apply to sales made to Missouri customers by Missouri retailers. So we do have a lot of Missouri businesses that are participating in the internet marketplace now. They're selling things over the internet to customers in Missouri, and in those cases, they're charging sales tax based on their business location in Missouri. State and local vendors use taxes apply to sales that are made to Missouri customers by retailers located outside the state of Missouri, provided the seller has a physical location in Missouri. But although some retailers are not required to collect the state and local use taxes, it should be there in Missouri, some voluntarily collect those taxes, and others collect only state taxes. Amazon is an example of this. They said, we don't have a physical location in Missouri, but we're going to voluntarily set up and collect the state taxes. Now, there's another point on this too. There are some companies that are registering and collecting and remitting the vendor's use tax already, even though they don't necessarily have to, because it's easier for them to do that than to try to separate Missouri from the other states that have already imposed it. Missouri is one of the last 2 states to address this issue, unfortunately. And we'll talk about that here in a minute too. But it may be easier for those retailers just to collect and remit the tax. There's nothing saying they can't do that if they don't want to. And so many of them are just going on and collecting and remitting the tax today, which is why when we start trying to figure out how much additional money this is going to be, it's very difficult. I know Chuck has looked at that, and I've looked at it too, and it's very difficult for us to figure out how much additional money we're going to get if the Wayfair law were to pass in Missouri. State and local consumers' use taxes are due today on internet sales from purchasers, and it does apply when a seller fails to collect the tax. You have up to $2,000 worth of goods that you can buy without being subject to this tax, and that's $2,000 on which no tax was collected. So those items that are taxed when you're buying them over the internet don't count, but when you reach $2,000 worth of goods that you purchased that way, that there was no tax on them, you are supposed to self-remit, file a return with the Department of Revenue. I think you can report it on your individual income tax return, and you can self-remit that tax to the Department of Revenue. As you can imagine, there are very few of those returns that come in that have that consumer's use tax on them. I think essentially it's only Department of Revenue employees that know that they'll lose their jobs if they don't pay the proper amount of tax that pay this tax. So it's a very inefficient way to collect the taxes, and it's much more efficient if you can collect it at point of sale like you do on everything else. And that's why it's important to pass the Wayfair bill in Missouri at some point. Proposals to expand Missouri's vendor use tax collection responsibility to all out-of-state companies selling more than $100,000 worth of goods to Missouri customers. That's what we're trying to do. You remember the South Dakota law had the 200 transaction threshold in there also. So if you sold more than 200 transactions to the customers in the state, or more than $100,000, then you had to register and collect. What we found is since the time that passed, one of the benefits of being later in the process is that we've got to see some of the mistakes that other states made, and that was one of them. You had a lot of people that were selling maybe $201 items, and then that would trigger their nexus. So they were still very small retailers, and they weren't making a lot of money, and it didn't make much sense for them to collect and remit the sales tax or use tax in whichever case. And so that has been removed by a lot of states. They're working now to go back and try to undo some of those transactional thresholds and sticking to the $100,000 worth of goods to Missouri customers. That's what we built into the legislation that's been pending here in Missouri. And then local use taxes would apply to these transactions if voters have approved the local use taxes in that area. So here are some of the questions. I tried to address some of the questions that we've received already on this. One of them that we addressed in the legislative session was, why not just call the internet tax a sales tax rather than a use tax and just allow local sales taxes to apply? Well, there are a couple of reasons for that. One is Missouri has had a use tax in place since 1959. So we have 61 years of history, legislative history and case law that addresses interstate sales as use tax transactions rather than sales tax transactions. Whenever you shift from one taxing method to another, you lose all of the legislative history that goes along with it. You lose all the case law history that's developed over time, and it starts over. So this would be kind of dangerous, we think, so just from a historical perspective. A vote would likely be required under the Missouri Constitution, since the local tax base would be significantly increased. So if you automatically just throw it in, all of this tax money starts flowing into these local governments, you likely would trigger the constitutional requirement to have a vote. So those are a couple of reasons why. And why do you need a local use tax voter approval? Why do voters have to approve that? Well, it's because of the Missouri Constitution, and I put the provision in here. You have to have, as a local political subdivision, either a city or a county, you're prohibited from levying any taxes or increasing the base of taxes over a certain amount without a voter approval. And in Missouri, this has been pretty well observed. There's also a legislative reason why you would need a voter approval, as we saw with the Street decision. We don't have a legislature that is tax and spend at this point. They're very cautious about taxes, and in fact, they want to try to reduce and eliminate taxes whenever they can. So they're going to ask for voter approval, even if the Constitution didn't require it. But local use taxes do need voter approval. This is the reason right here. Why doesn't the state just establish one local use tax rate statewide? Well, guess what? This is where my legislative history comes into play. I was working at the Department of Revenue in the 90s when we actually did enact a statewide local use tax. It was 1.5%. It applied to all sales that were made into the state by vendors that were required to collect the tax at the time. It was distributed to local governments based on your percentage of sales tax collections versus sales tax collections statewide. So whatever your percentage of that was, that's what you got out of that 1.5% local use tax. Interestingly enough, now I was the person that drafted that bill, shepherded it through the legislative process. I lobbied on behalf of the Department of Revenue, got it passed. It was challenged by Associated Industries of Missouri, which that's a group I now lead, which is very ironic, I think, in my opinion. But AIM challenged that. Alumax Foils was one of their members, and they challenged it in a case that went to the U.S. Supreme Court eventually. The U.S. Supreme Court ruled March 26 of 1996 that the tax impermissibly discriminated against interstate commerce because there were some areas of the state where the combined use tax rate on these interstate transactions was higher than the combined sales tax rate for local transactions. And there is a constitutional prohibition against burdening interstate commerce. That's a U.S. constitutional provision, nothing we can do about that. And they said, well, in those areas where the tax rate is higher on those use tax transactions, you're burdening that commerce by artificially encouraging local sales. And so they threw that tax out. So then Missouri went back to the drawing board. What do we do? And so I was at Department of Revenue still at that time. And so we came up with a new local option use tax that would meet the constitutional requirements of this case. We had a new local option use tax. It had to be equal to the local sales tax. The rate increases and decreases with the local sales tax rate, but it is now called a local option use tax. And that's where it came from. That's why it's like it is. Would it be easier to have one local use tax statewide? I think it would be. It'd be much easier for the retailers that are selling into Missouri. One of the most complicated parts of our sales tax system in Missouri is the fact that we have all of these taxing jurisdictions. We're one of the few that has as many as we do. I don't remember how many thousand we have, but Chuck can help me. It's more than 2,000 different tax rates across the state of Missouri. So it would be much easier, but the court said no. And I don't think if Associated Industries had not challenged this, someone was going to challenge it at some point in time. It's good that they challenged it quickly because there was only one or 2 years worth of tax before that court case came back down and refunds were required. And that caused a lot of you, if you were local governments that were, if you were in charge of your local government back then, you remember that they had to take the money out of your sales tax distributions for refund claims that came in. And that was a very tough time for a lot of local governments. So that misstep, that caused a lot of disruption to the local tax scheme. But that's what we're dealing with. The local use tax does require a vote of the people. So why not just join, this is another question we get, why not just join the Streamlined Sales and Use Tax Agreement? Early on, I was actually one of the, again, here's a Forrest Gump moment for you. At the Department of Revenue, when the Streamline project first started, I was named to the group that was helping Missouri determine whether we should participate in the Streamlined Sales and Use Tax Agreement. And I helped with the initial conversations and we went to a lot of meetings with a lot of people from other states, businesses, other state tax administrators. And we developed the Streamlined Sales and Use Tax Agreement. A lot of meetings, a lot of time put into that agreement. It's a very long agreement. It's more than 100 pages. And it was developed over time. But adopting that in Missouri would require dramatic changes to our Missouri sales tax laws. And when I worked, as I moved from state government over to the private sector, I continued to be involved with that group. Still all wanting the same thing, to develop a system that was easy for people to comply with, but it would cause dramatic changes to Missouri sales tax laws. Let's talk about a couple of those. One of the changes would require shifting to a point of delivery local tax system. This would impact your local government revenues from businesses that regularly deliver to customers outside their local jurisdiction. So furniture stores right now, if you have a furniture store in your taxing jurisdiction within the city, they're collecting tax based on the location where their store is. If we were to join the Streamlined Sales and Use Tax Agreement, that would shift, and those sales would then be due, the taxes would be due based on where they deliver those goods. So you can think of your surrounding communities. County governments, there'd be no change because you're already getting the tax, but it would complicate things for the retailer, and it would shift taxes away from those urban centers where those stores are located to maybe some of the surrounding communities. If you're a surrounding community, you kind of like that idea. But the complication factor, if you can imagine what that would do to a retailer that's a furniture dealer or appliance dealer or food delivery, pizza delivery, for example, all of that would have to shift to be the point of delivery in order to comply with the Streamlined Sales and Use Tax Agreement. That's one of the things. There are a lot of things that would cause us to not want to do that. So what has happened is we have been negotiating with the Streamlined Sales and Use Tax Agreement leaders, and there is a provision now that they have provided to states like Missouri where making that change is just too complicated. They have allowed states to participate in a very limited way. But these are very important participation points. What they would do is allow central registration. So the Streamlined Sales and Use Tax Agreement has been going for a while. They have a number of states that have joined them. If we joined in a limited way, then the companies that they have that have already registered with them, they would just flip a switch and they would be on, which helps us a lot. New companies that are wanting to sell into Missouri could use their central registration system. They're already used to dealing with that because they fill out one application and boom, they're done. It's very easy for the retailers to do that, and we think that would ease compliance in Missouri. It also would allow Missouri to enjoy a negotiated price that they have set up with certified service providers. And I don't want to get in the weeds too far here, except to say that certified service providers are, there are these groups, software groups that exist out there. And this is a provision of the Streamlined Sales and Use Tax Agreement. If we were to adopt the Wayfair bill that we most recently negotiated that Chuck's been working on, this would allow the certified service providers to exist in Missouri and to be paid for actually by the state out of some of the discounts that otherwise a retailer would get. And the rate that they're paid is negotiated by the Streamlined Sales and Use Tax Agreement for those streamlined states. We would adopt that and actually allow us to use their negotiated rates with those certified service providers. As the taxes have taken off, the costs for those certified service providers have gone down because the more critical mass they have, the highest cost was when they first started doing it. Now they have the entire state of Missouri mapped. They showed us their rate system. They can tell you even if you're standing in a field that has no address, they can look at your geo coordinates and tell what the tax should be. So they are very sophisticated in terms of their ability to determine the correct rate. And we think that is something that we should take advantage of. And now that they have opened up their doors a little bit and allowed this central registration and the negotiated service providers price to states like Missouri, that would be something that we would think would be very attractive. And so we've worked that into the legislation that was being considered. So the other question we get, why hasn't Wayfair passed in Missouri? And this is the million-dollar question. And we can settle that for you, I think, today. This is the biggest problem right here that's on your screen. Legislators do not agree on the use of the additional tax money. Some want to use the tax money to fill budget holes that have developed, especially since the coronavirus hit. Others want to see other taxes reduced. Some would like to use the money for specific purposes. We've seen proposals that would want to use it for transportation, for example. And there's no real good agreement on how to use this money. There are differences between different legislators, and Chuck has to deal with this every day. There are differences between all the senators. There are differences between what the Senate wants and what the House wants. Different House members in different positions have varying levels of expertise in this area, and a lot of different ideas on what to do with the tax money. And that is the biggest fight has been trying to figure out what to do with that money, but it's not the only thing. One of the problems is the local taxes. What do you do with them? Whether the local taxes should require a second vote, even of local use taxes that have been adopted, has been discussed, because when the local use taxes were originally adopted, internet sales weren't being taxed in the way that they would be under the new law. You still had the consumer's tax, but you didn't have the vendors collecting the tax. And some legislators think that even if you have a local use tax, you should have to have another vote on the local use tax. That's one idea. And then others involve local sales taxes, whether local sales taxes should apply rather than use taxes, and then what local tax rate should be charged, perhaps a different rate than the existing local use tax. Maybe it should be at 2% rather than the full percent. We don't know. Lots of different ideas on how to handle the local taxes. So that's another complication. And then this is the biggest one here. And this is the one that Senator Andrew Koenig from the St. Louis area has been the chief deal maker on the Senate side. And bless his heart, he has really done a lot of work to try to figure out how he can pass a bill through the Senate that can also make it through the House. You think about that when you've got all these different ideas, and he's trying to work through that to find a compromise position that can make it through the Senate, which is the Senate is the first hurdle because one senator can block a bill. If you get past that, so you have to make all these deals to get the bill through the Senate, then you got to deal with the House, and will the House take up and pass what the Senate has sent them? We have not seen that level of agreement develop really yet. The hope was if we could get a bill out of the Senate, then we could talk to the House and try to negotiate a middle position. But the political deal making is extremely difficult, and Senator Koenig has done a yeoman's job trying to get this done. He's worked with the senators. He thought he had at least some majority compromise, and he brought the bill up on the floor. We spent several hours on it during this last session before the coronavirus hit. And it just was people started loading the bill up with everything they could think of that was tax related, and that killed it. Some of that was on purpose. Some people wanted to kill the bill. Some people just wanted their ideas to pass and they couldn't find any other way to do it. He was very frustrated, having worked with the senators and talked to them several different times, pulled the bill off the floor, went back and was renegotiating it when COVID hit and we weren't able to talk about it anymore. So we've made progress, but we have not made enough progress to be able to pass the bill in the state of Missouri, and we're continuing to work on it. But these are the reasons why it has not passed in Missouri. So if you're a local government and you're trying to make the case for addressing Wayfair, or if you're a business, actually, this is our position as well, for addressing Wayfair and the local use tax. So really you have two items here. One, if you're a local government, you have to convince your local voters, if you don't have a local use tax already, you need to convince them that they need to adopt one. So why would you do that? Well, local businesses are collecting and remitting state and local taxes on sales made to Missouri customers. So they're competing with these internet businesses. And more of those stores are being replaced by retail websites. Even your local retailers are likely participating at some level in interstate commerce. But so even for those companies that have a presence in your city right now, look at what's happening to your malls. A lot of those stores are going out of business in the mall. A lot of them are going to continue to operate, but they're going to operate through the internet because that's where the way people are making purchases, especially during a COVID event, which I think we may see more of in the future. The current situation does create an unfair government-imposed burden on Missouri businesses as they try to compete with the internet retailers. So if you go to your local store and you buy something, you pay a sales tax on it. If you buy something over the internet from a retailer that doesn't have any locations in Missouri, they're not hiring people in your state, they don't have any property in your state, they're not paying any property taxes, they get an additional benefit of having that tax advantage over your local retailers. That's a big reason to adopt the Wayfair, and for your local governments to see that they're losing money now because their local sales tax monies are dropping off. This local use tax would help augment that and create a more level playing field. And then the everybody else is doing it argument. All states except one have adopted their legislation to collect internet taxes and are collecting those taxes from our businesses that sell into those states. So we have Missouri retailers that are selling into all these other states. They're having to collect taxes for these other states, but other state retailers that are selling into Missouri customers don't have that same obligation. So that's another reason you could use. I think we'll be sending these slides out to everyone, Andrea. If you don't mind, I sent you the PDF. If you could send that out to everyone after the presentation, that would probably be helpful for them. And now we're down to the questions part. So Andrea, if you have questions that have been submitted, I'm all ears.
Thanks so much, Ray. And I'm sure that we'll start getting questions in. I've got a couple for you for clarification. And yes, we have been recording this. And so we will be able to send out the recording along with these slides. Such a wealth of knowledge on this topic. I wanted to just first ask you and kind of open this up. What can we do as economic development professionals, as municipal stakeholders? Some of elected officials are here on this call as well. What can we do to support this effort?
I think, and Chuck, you can help me with this too, but I think the way you can help the most is to talk to your local legislators. Let them know how important this is. Let them know, and I think it's important as you get the presentation, let's go back to the type of tax that it needs to be. I think it's important to go back and let them know that we're supportive of having the taxes like they are now and just expanding them so that they apply to these internet retailers. That's the simplest way to do it. It does not affect your local retailers at all. So doing a use tax is very important, and doing the local use tax is important as well. I understand some local governments have had trouble getting that past the voters, and frankly, that's part of the problem. Legislators look at that and say, well, if the local voters don't want to tax themselves, then why should we make them? And we're not in an environment now in the legislature where the legislature feels comfortable enacting taxes that local voters don't support. So I think that's something that you just have to take to the voters. I think that's how you can help, is educating the public. You know, we've given you some reasons on the slide that I had that showed why you should adopt a local use tax. I think getting that message out there so people understand that you're losing money that you're using to support your police and fire and streets and everything else. You're losing that revenue stream as those in-state businesses, your Main Street businesses, either go out entirely or they're selling less because people are buying more things from the internet.
Absolutely. And we're starting to get some questions in. One of the questions that just came through, do we need the state of Missouri to pass legislation to collect state tax and local cities, counties to pass the tax to collect local tax? Does one affect the other?
So the state has to enact the law to allow the tax to be collected at all. So we do have to pass a state bill. At the local level, what you have to do, the legislation is already done in terms of your ability to impose a local use tax. The statutes are already there. You just have to take that to a vote of the people. So you would have to put it on your ballot and run a campaign and get that passed for local use taxes to apply. The state level does require, and the state and local is all triggered on this state legislation. That's why it's so important. It's also why we have such a choke point, because the Missouri Senate, as I said, one senator can block a piece of legislation, and that's what we have more than one that's willing to do that. The elections, the most recent elections that we had in the primaries, there are some people who are going to be serving now in the Senate, completely anti-tax. If anything, our job got harder and will be harder when these people are running in November. Some of them don't even have opposition, so we know they're going to be in the Senate, and they've already expressed their anti-tax sentiments to the point that they don't even want to collect this tax at all. Any tax is a no-no in their book. So again, contacting your local legislators is going to be very important. Let them know that you support doing this and the reasons that, you know, you're trying to help these Main Street businesses compete with internet businesses. And you know, here's the slide making the case. This is why you need to do it. Communicate this message to your local legislators and educate your public. You know, if the public looks at this, all it takes is a very cheap campaign to be run, or even a whisper campaign in a lot of your smaller jurisdictions, to just say, we don't want to pay taxes on the internet. And that causes it to go down. People need to understand that if you don't find revenue from the sources that you have had them before, namely sales taxes, those sales taxes start disappearing. You need this local use tax to help fill those gaps, or you're going to be deficient. And what do you have to do? Then you'll have to raise property taxes. You'll have to raise some other types of taxes, or you've got to cut services. And I think if you educate people, that's the way the voters that have adopted these taxes in a lot of areas across the state, that's how they've been able to pass it, is by saying, look, you're missing out on a revenue stream that otherwise you could have.
Absolutely. And, you know, that highlights one of the things that you did mention that is a big fear, I think, for a lot of municipalities or counties that may have passed this already, especially in recent years, is the fact that you mentioned one of the provisions or one of the versions of these bills that we've seen in the state legislature would require a revote to pass this. And can you explain that a little bit further?
Yes, that is very problematic, I think, because you would have, if they did require that, aside from the fact that a lot of your local governments that have already imposed it would be just expecting that they've done enough, and they have under current law, you would have a situation where you could potentially have those areas that have a local use tax that applies to other use tax transactions. So people that aren't selling over the internet, but just shipping into Missouri from an out-of-state location through any other means. you would have one rate for them, and potentially if voters did not adopt the internet tax rate, you would have a lower rate for those internet transactions. So you would have actually, you just set up really a new type of tax, and it would be extremely complicated. The more complicated things are, the worse it is for both the customers as well as the tax collectors, which are the businesses. And it's extremely difficult for you as the local government then trying to figure out and separate those sales. It would be really, I don't see any way we could properly administer that. And I think that's one of the reasons why communication with your local state officials is very important. So your state reps and your state senators, it's extremely important that they understand that that would be a big no-no, trying to set up two different, or requiring a revote of those local use taxes, because it really would set up an extra layer of complexity. And actually, if it gets too complex, the US Supreme Court, if someone were to challenge it, could throw it out. One of the things that happened with the Wayfair case is they really did go out on a limb in reversing Quill and Bellis Hess by saying you can tax these internet sales, but you have to do it in a way that's simple for those retailers to comply. And think about it, if you're a business and you're selling into, Louisiana, you want to know that if you have to collect and remit sales tax from customers, many businesses are willing to do that. But you don't want to have it so complicated that you end up, having a big audit liability in that state. And believe me, we have aggressive auditors here in the state of Missouri, so I'm sure other states have them as well. And that's all you need, is to lay yourself open for additional findings in an audit and have to pay tax out of your pocket you didn't collect. So the more complicated it is, the tougher it is to comply, and the more risk you have that your bill is not going to survive a challenge if it were taken to the US Supreme Court.
Yeah, that's a scary thought, especially since it seems to the layperson extremely complicated already. So we don't want to add anything else to that.
And one more thing, remember what happened with the local use tax. You had a refund situation that was triggered when that tax was found to be unconstitutional. And that caused a lot, I remember, because I was at Revenue then, a lot of local governments had a real difficult time. There were some that didn't get any sales tax payments for a month or two or three. And, excuse me, local governments depend on that money. So if you set up something that is going to be challenged and you have a refund situation, it's extremely difficult because you have to do refunds on the back end.
Absolutely. And I wanted to circle back to the issue of the vehicular sales tax or vehicle use tax that you mentioned. And on one of your slides, you noted a date of November 2022. Just for clarification, is that something that can be handled at the state level, or do our local jurisdictions have to pass it by that deadline, or they are in harm of losing the revenue that they have already been receiving?
Right. So the question you have to put, and it's local governments have to do it, you have to put the question before voters on by the November 22 ballot. So you could do it at that election in November of 2022. But the local governments have to be the ones putting that question out there. And it's asking if they want to repeal the tax on vehicle sales that are made by anyone other than a Missouri dealer. So you're asking the voters, do you want to repeal this? And there's specific language in the statute that you have to put in that ballot question.
Thank you so much for that. I haven't seen any additional questions come in. So if you have a question, please submit that quickly. We also have Chuck on the call, and he's just been hanging out with us. Chuck, do you have any thoughts? I know you're walking the halls for AIM, and you also work alongside Brian Grace, who is, of course, the lobbyist for the Missouri Economic Development Council. Weigh in on this. What are your thoughts?
I think you'll need to unmute him.
Okay, let me go back.
There we go.
I got it.
Okay.
All right. Yes.
Yes,
right.
thank you.
I think Ray did a great job. The only thing I would add, I'll elaborate on, just to make it clear on what's totally confusing with that motor vehicle. There are two paths to collecting that tax. One, the locality can just pass the regular local use tax. Then that will also bring in the motor vehicle, or they can pass the language that's in the statute that just applies to the motor vehicles. given that we're really close to getting Wayfair passed at the state level, it would behoove local governments to just pass a local use tax if they don't already have one. So then they won't have to have another election once the state passes that.
That's a really good point. And then you're killing two birds with one stone. Then you're already ready if we're able to pass the Wayfair bill, then you're already set up to collect your local taxes on those transactions, and you fix the problem of having to submit that repeal thing to the voters. Good point, Chuck.
Right. And it's also, I mean, if that goes on the local ballot before the state passes it, it's kind of a theoretical tax because it really doesn't apply to internet sellers without a physical presence nexus until the state passes something else.
That's right. So as a local government, if you're promoting that, you can say it doesn't apply to internet sales, right? I don't know if I would say that, but you can avoid that. You can avoid that question because there are some that are collecting it already voluntarily, and they will look at that local use tax rate and go on and collect that as well.
Right. And if the state passes a fix, then there's going to be tax on internet sales. It's just that the local government is not going to get their share of that. The state, right. So your consumers that are in your jurisdiction are going to pay tax on internet sales if this Wayfair bill passes, but the city and county is just not going to get their share of it.
That's right. That's
sure.
right.
Well, and we also have a lot of rural areas on the webinar with us today. With AIM and how you guys work hand in hand with businesses, thoughts for us at the local level on how to encourage or kind of dispel the myth that this passing might actually harm them. I know we heard that from some of our local and smaller businesses that this was going to complicate things for them and they weren't really sure how to turn and what resources. Can you give us some direction on how we can converse with our business community?
Yes, I think that goes back to that streamlined sales and use tax because for a long time that controlled the conversation. And back early on, we're talking years ago, before the Wayfair decision, streamlined sales and use tax project was the only game in town. And so in order for us to comply with that streamlined project, there were a lot of changes that we needed to make that would affect your local retailers, as I explained before, your furniture dealers, your delivery businesses, a lot of those things would have to change. That's all can be cured by just doing the local use tax. And so things have changed now. The streamlined sales and use tax project is not something we're pursuing. It's not something that's being proposed, but a lot of the negativity around it still permeates, and a lot of people still are thinking that that's what we would have to do in order to comply. We don't anymore. And this deal that we worked out with the Streamlined group to be able to take advantage of the most attractive parts of their system without having to adopt the full-fledged agreement is really the best of both worlds for Missouri businesses as well as local governments, because it allows us to get in and get that central registration, to get the negotiated rate for those service providers. And it really does provide a lot of benefit without any of the negative parts that people have heard about it. So I think education again is the big deal. It's I know I'm going to be talking about this at the Missouri Economic Development fall meeting as well, and hopefully those economic developers in the area and all of you who are economic developers on the call, you can help educate your local government as well. And if you need help with that, certainly reach out to me. I know Andrea, that's how we started this conversation. Andrea had reached out to me, and John Maynard put us in touch. And I know, so Brian Grace is going to be giving the legislative update at the fall meeting of the MEDC, and then I will be there to help just on this one point. But it's extremely important to educate your voters and your local officials and your state and local reps and senators. Let them know how important this is to you and that something needs to get done. We are the next to the last state. I think, isn't Florida the only other one that doesn't have this, Chuck, right now?
Yeah.
And Kansas,
in that regard, Ray, the one thing I would add is that for your local businesses, they're impacted by what other states do. So if you're a Missouri business and you're selling into Missouri, you're collecting the tax, even if it's on the internet, because you have physical presence nexus. Where the complexity for the local business is the other 35 states they're selling into who've already passed this law. That's where they have to track compliance. If Missouri passes a Wayfair statute, it does not affect Missouri businesses selling to Missouri consumers by whatever means they are. They're under the existing law.
That's right. And Missouri businesses aren't affected by that at all because they're already collecting tax in the other states
Correct.
on the internet sales. They're collecting taxes here in Missouri on sales they make to Missouri customers. So from a Missouri business standpoint, we're all in to pass this. And we've been trying to work out the details and do it in a way that we can get past. But it's been extremely difficult. I can't tell you how much work it is. You know, we have 163 House members and 34 senators, and Chuck has to try to get all of them on the same page, or at least a majority of them in the House, and you know, really all of the senators to agree to let a bill go like this at least go, even if they vote no. That's an extremely tough bar, and it's something that requires a lot of work. Chuck's in the Capitol every day. I'm there a lot of times too. And we have to handle a lot of questions. The people that you elect and send to Jeff City, you know, are just like you. They all have questions as well. And we try to answer those questions as best we can and get around to those that have questions. But very often there are little conversations that develop over in one pocket and you don't know what's going on, and they come out in the hearing and boom, they come up with some brilliant idea that no one else has ever adopted. And the more novel the idea, the more new the concept, the more difficult it is to fit it into the taxing scheme. So Chuck does a wonderful job, I know, for Associated Industries, and we really appreciate him and his expertise in the Capitol. And I'm here to try to help, you know, answer questions as well. So when you'll get my contact information. Andrea will send that out, I think, with the slides. And certainly email me is the best way to catch me because I am a little busy. But send me emails and I can forward them to Chuck if we need Chuck's expertise on this as well. And if I can help you at all in you know what you're doing to try to get this thing off the ground, let me know. I'm happy to help.
I really appreciate that. And we want to be mindful of your time. I did have one more clarification question come through. Do you have time for one more?
Sure.
Okay, and this is again going back to that motor vehicle issue, just really breaking it down. I feel like when we get you in Branson for the fall conference, I need a whiteboard and I just need to start drawing lines as you talk. But this question came in and they said, please describe more about the motor vehicle portion of the use tax as compared and contrasted with the local use tax. I think there are a lot of areas that don't really understand the implications that could potentially have on their budget. So can you just kind of break that down lastly for us before we wrap up?
Okay, and this is probably the most confusing part. So if you're buying a car from a dealer in Missouri, you're paying tax based on where you live, where that vehicle is going to be located. That's the tax that you're paying. So if you're located inside the city limits, you're paying that city tax, you're paying that county tax. If you're outside the city limits, you're paying just the county tax. And that's the way that works for cars that you buy from a dealer in Missouri. If you're buying from a dealer outside the state of Missouri, or if you're buying from an individual, you're paying in effect a different tax. It's a tax for the privilege of licensing the vehicle in the state of Missouri, but it's handled exactly. So if you have a local use tax, it comes in and fills in that blank, and if you have a local use tax, you're getting the money on that transaction. If you don't have a local use tax, then you're not. And the local sales taxes have been applied now to those transactions, with the caveat that by November of 2022, you have to put a proposal to repeal that tax unless you've adopted the local use tax. So by passing the local use tax, you cure that problem as well as set yourself up to be able to collect tax on internet sales. Did I miss anything there, Chuck?
No, I think that's accurate. So if you don't have a local use tax, you're currently getting the out-of-state motor vehicle tax until 2022. Now, if you wanted to go to a vote of the people and just vote the motor vehicle tax, you could do that separately and not tax internet sales. And if you don't do anything, then you're going to lose that revenue.
That's right. So the way you can cure both problems and keep yourself from having to ask voters if they want to repeal that tax is to pass the local use tax before you get to November 2022. So you should be planning now to try to get that on the ballot and try to run a campaign to get that done if that's something you want to do.
Well, gentlemen, I really appreciate it. And we have got some thoughts in about that infographic idea. So I may be getting with you both and a graphic designer to try to put that together.
Okay.
Again, the part that and the onus that lands on all of us is really connecting with our local legislators. And that's why, we're edging into the end of September, getting ready to start fourth quarter of 2020. And we want to start this early. Now is the time for all of us to really be building those relationships with our local legislators. I know it's crazy with the elections happening, but we have to be building that trust. And that way, when we have to ask them and approach them about these vital issues for our communities, those lines of communication are already open. I know here in Christian County, we just recently expanded the board for Show Me Christian County and are establishing a governmental relations committee just to tackle this issue as an example and other things that may impact our local areas. So if you're here in the region and you have questions about how we're doing that, we're very new. Again, Springfield Chamber has a great public policy committee, and utilize your resources as well through AIM, through the Missouri Economic Development Council, and also the Missouri Municipal League. Again, you can join us here in October. We will be having an in-person conference, and Ray will be speaking on this topic again. That will be October 14th through the 16th. You can email me at andrea@showmeccmo.com for that information, or you can also find that on the Missouri Economic Development Council's website. Ray, Chuck, again, we thank you both so much. We need people like you. I think you're both gluttons for punishment, but we're glad that you're doing it, and we're glad that you're in the trenches on this issue.
Well, Andrea, thank you. And I do want to say, as you're talking with your local legislators, it may behoove you to point out to them that you're really just trying to replace revenue. You're not wanting a new tax to grow your funds. You're trying to replace what you're losing. And with as many businesses as have had to leave because of COVID and because of the internet impact before COVID even, I think it's pretty apparent for most legislators. They can see what's happening in their local communities, but they need to hear that from you, that it is a problem. And really what you're asking them to do is replace that with the same type of stream that has been there before at the local level. And if you explain it that way, you may get a lot more people willing to buy into it than if you tell them it's a new tax, because frankly, new taxes are just dead on arrival in the Missouri General Assembly right now.
Absolutely. Well, all good thoughts. Again, thank you both so much for your time and sharing this hour with us. Reach out to me or Ray. Again, we'll share the contact information, and I hope you all have a wonderful day.
Great. Thanks very much.
Ray, if you can make me the host.
Yeah. Do you want me to just end it?
Make me the host and I'll stop the recording, and then we'll end it that way.
Okay. Hang on. Sorry about that.
No worries. Thank you so much for spending time with us today.
Well, I appreciate the invitation. And if you have other questions, certainly reach out to me. I'm happy to help. Did you get it?
Yes.